generally speaking, what we've done is we've had a culture within male culture that, if you look throughout history, has made it possible for men to share the depths of their being, to talk about their challenges, to talk about their problems, to talk about their pain. And instead, what we've replaced it with is this notion within masculine culture that you become a stronger man through suppression, that strength equals suppression, that the more that you can stuff shit down, the stronger you'll be.
What's up, man?
You know what I was thinking about when... Well, first off, thanks for having me.
Dude,
but
we have talks all the time. We might as well just record them.
I agree. You know, what I was going to say is I think that we undervalue as human beings getting to be a fly on the wall in other people's conversations, you know, especially like people that we respect or admire.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
I think that sometimes some of the best conversations and podcasts that I've listened to are just people that I respect and admire, whether it's intellectually or from a spiritual level, just sort of talking, you know,
agreed.
about what they think about, and not in like a scripted way, but just kind of getting to be a fly on the wall. And the other thing I was going to say is that when I walked in to this little room here, I got a flashback of us sitting on your couch in your old apartment.
In York. When we did the pod?
In York. Yeah, the first pod that we did.
The first ManTalks.
That
was
right.
A ManTalks pod.
That's right. And we recorded it, and I don't even remember what we talked about. It was arguably probably pretty mediocre.
Yeah. You know, I appreciate the assessment, the rating in hindsight.
Right.
You know, I also gave my first talk on relationships at a ManTalks event, the second ManTalks event, I believe
That's
it was,
true.
right?
That's true.
I went to the first one, the inaugural. And that was such an opportunity. Thank you for that. You know, in hindsight, that was like, I think I had given a talk with Aaron Sky Kelly at Transformation Weekend, but not about something so personal.
Yeah.
Of course, ManTalks was about sharing the personal transformation, the personal experience. And I remember I said at the beginning, not every relationship is meant to last forever. And people being in the audience like, okay, buddy. Like, I don't agree. And it's great. But not everyone does. So I guess I'm right.
There you go.
You know?
That's true.
Like, sorry about your luck, but...
It's true. But it made me think, you know, walking into the studio, we're sitting in Manhattan.
It's pretty cool.
You know, I'm married and I have a kid. You're doing incredible things. To see where our lives have gone since sitting on the couch in your apartment, you know, in Vancouver, and at the sort of beginning of this journey.
Yeah.
And then to be sitting here with you right now. And I mean, how much life has come in between then and now, but just to have watched your growth and who you've become, it's been such a treat to be your friend and to be by your side, you know, through this, and to have a genuine companion and brother in arms as we've like gone through this, because it's been some really fucking hard times, you know, some really hard times in both of our
breakups,
lives.
Starting relationships, getting back together.
Yeah.
I was single, I think, when we did our first pod, probably.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I would have been.
Yeah, it was like pre-Kylie.
Yeah, it was pre-Kylie. BK.
Yeah.
BK.
PK?
PK.
Yeah.
It was, PK.
Not yeah.
No, pre-Kylie, not before Kylie.
I feel like there's part of Kylie's spiritual ego that would love that notion.
She would,
you know,
yeah.
It's like, oh, before Kylie.
The essence of Christ in Kylie. Yeah, man, it's been a journey, and you know, you've been a guest on the pod a couple times now. This will be the third, I think.
I think so, yeah, once or twice. Yeah.
You're three-peating.
Yep.
And keeps getting better, unlike Michael Jordan when he kept coming back. But this is, I'm really excited to have you here. And your work with men has been, I mean, revolutionary in a lot of ways. Because when you started, there wasn't a lot of conversation about men.
Yeah.
There might have been more like men's right movements, or what people might call like red pill movement, or whatever the term is, which I think a part of, although there's value certainly in those movements, and they exist for a reason.
There's like a lot of underground stuff.
Totally.
You know, it was like, I think the men's movement happened, you know, with what most people know is like the mytho-poetic movement with Robert Bly, like back in the 70s and 80s. And then it sort of just was underground. I think the Mankind movement, Mankind Project.
Oh yeah, Mankind was great.
You know, I think they sort of carried on this tradition. But then myself and a few other people were sort of at the beginning of this wave of men talking about therapeutic modalities,
Mm-hmm.
and talking about the sort of moving aside the veil and the curtain of masculinity and what we normally would talk about, and have more honest conversations about just the shit that was going on in our lives. Yeah, I feel like there was some luck and coincidence that I started ManTalks when I did, because I look out today and there's tons of people
Yeah, there's
that
some
are
really powerful men's
yeah
movements going
yeah
on.
that are and that aren't necessarily doing quote unquote men's work or a part of the men's movement, but are just speaking to men in a very different way, from truth and transparency and authenticity. I look at people like Jordan Peterson or Aubrey Marcus, who have very different perspectives, but are, I think, reaching men in a way and calling them forward into a kind of authenticity and transparency that I think has lapsed a few generations.
Yeah, I agree.
That transparency didn't necessarily show up in our fathers' lives or maybe even their fathers' lives.
Yeah, a lot of when I think of the men's rights versus conversations,
Yeah.
right? Because I think the men's rights movements is often confused with movements like ManTalks, like Mankind
Mm.
Project, and this idea that, like, who are men to have needs and desires and spaces when the world has oriented around men,
Hmm.
right? That seems to be often a criticism, probably more from women, which makes total sense.
Yep.
And there is validity in the basis of that concern or care. It also, what the nuance that lacks, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, is that it still perpetuates this idea that emotionality in men, and I don't know how to say this right, there probably is no right way,
Mm.
but that emotionality in men even is often misconstrued, maybe because we've weaponized emotionality sometimes, or like if it's, like, they don't trust that if there's a space where we're talking about love and vulnerability and how the world has hurt us, or
Right.
like sends us to war and kills us and puts us in the highest risk jobs generally.
Yeah.
It's like they don't trust when we want to actually talk about these things like that. Maybe it's just more manipulation or more.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think about that? And am I assessing that criticism correctly?
Yeah. I mean, I think
You would hear a lot of it.
it's,
So
I don't know how much value there is in us getting into like gender politics or identity politics. I think we should probably steer
Yeah.
clear of that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah.
But what I will say is that, I think there's this, men have built a lot of the world, for good or for bad. I think it's just factual. If you look at the job ranges within plumbing and electricians and the infrastructure that runs our societies, like, men have built a lot of that. And so there is this notion that men control a lot. And then, historically within the political sphere and sometimes within religious spheres as well, there's obviously sometimes there's very much overlap between those two things.
Yeah.
And there's often, men that are in those positions making those decisions. So when it comes to things like men's rights, it's very challenging, I think, and rightfully so, I think, for some people to see, like, maybe being a man in certain cultures or in certain time periods isn't all that it's cracked up to be. And there's this notion that men have all the power, and that because this notion that if you, as a man, you have all the power, then you must have it good.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we often overlook, maybe there's an oversight sometimes that comes along with the price and the cost that can come along with that. And we oftentimes focus in on the people who have abused that power, who have been abusive, who have taken advantage of it, who have been harmful,
Mm-hmm.
who have accumulated a tremendous amount of power.
Mm-hmm.
And then that becomes the kind of blanket statement that goes out across all men, right? It's like all men are this way and all men are that way. And I think that that's the damaging perspective, is to take what a couple men do and say all men are this way. We would never socially or culturally within our modern times do that with women. We would never say, oh, these women were abusive and they abused power, and so all women are this way. I don't think that any gender or any sex wants to be categorized that way. So I think that's part of the challenge. But there's truth in the sense that men historically have been the more violent of the species.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, that's just
Yeah.
factual. And I think from an evolutionary standpoint, for a long time, that violence actually served a function. When we step back and can look at, hey, maybe this biological imperative that has existed within us, this served a purpose, you know, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, maybe even 500 years ago, maybe even 100 years ago. Within our modern times, maybe it doesn't serve as much of a function or a purpose. But I think the challenge is that violence has obviously hurt a lot of women, you know,
Right.
and a lot of children and a lot of other men. And so, you know, I think we have to look at what it means to be violent, what it means to be aggressive, and not confuse those things with assertiveness and directness and anger, because I think sometimes those things get conflated. And that we, you know, we can look at the responsibility that we as men carry within our culture and our society, because generally speaking, men respond to a sense of calling. You know, we like being called to something, called to battle, called to fix a problem, called to contribute to something. And I think that right now, another way of saying that, I'll come back to it, is we like to feel needed. You know, we find function and purpose. It's like, oh, you need me to take care of that. You know, you want me to fix that, or oh, I can support this movement or help figure out this problem that is going to make people's lives better. It's like, I love that shit. You know, it's like I think most men, we thrive when we feel needed, and we thrive when we feel called into something. And so I think what's challenging about the current narratives that talk about men and masculinity is that a lot of it is steeped in this sort of hatred towards men and mistrust of men. And I get where it comes from. Right? It comes from like, I was hurt by men. But I think the notion that we, you know, continue to put out of like, oh, I don't need a man. And, you know, I see these articles of like, would the world be better without men? You know, really genuinely asking that question.
I saw somewhere, I forget which famous person said that testosterone is actually evil.
James Cameron. Right. I saw
like,
that and I was like,
that
what
gotta be. I was like, is this a Babylon Bee? Like, what is happening here?
It wasn't.
I was like, that actually is it's not the hormone that is destructive. Yeah. I mean, first off, women have testosterone too, and
generally though in much smaller quantities.
Yeah, fair enough. But it's like, testosterone isn't the reason. It's like toxic masculinity. I've from the beginning been critical of that statement, not because I don't believe men can be destructive or there is a propensity for men for their unintegrated trauma, their
pain, their hurt,
splits, their rejections, their you know, all the stuff. It is outwardly more destructive. And I find women, and these are generalizations, so this isn't going to be true for everybody, women tend to be inwardly more destructive. And again, I say that just as I'm just thinking out loud. You're listening to a conversation, okay? I'm not positive about all these things. But as I postulate there feels like there's some truth in there, and maybe not. But the toxic masculinity is really just unintegrated trauma, or like lack of integration, lack of healing.
Yeah.
Just like, you know, the word healing or moves about restoring wholeness.
Right.
You said we would never talk about women in a certain way. We would never say toxic femininity. Are there ways that women can express or have how their unintegrated trauma shows up, that it can be toxic to relationships? Of course.
Yeah.
Because this is about unintegrated humans.
Yes.
Or traumatized humans.
Yeah.
And so the idea that testosterone is what are we just going to have, a testosterone-free world? And to be fair, that's with all the plastics we're consuming and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
there is some signs to show that. Like, I forget the researcher, but she talks about how fertility in males is plummeting, and testosterone rates, and I believe they measure it by the measurement between the testicles and the butthole, the chota?
The perineum.
Yeah,
perineum.
The chota, okay?
Chota. I mean,
that's the scientific term.
The taint.
Okay? Yeah, the taint. That space gets, I think it's shorter with the less experience. Anyways, I know there's a whole science on that, which is fascinating.
I think that if we eradicate the biological differences between men and women, it causes problems in how we relate to one another. Because, you know, if you talk to a boy that's gone through puberty and he has high levels of testosterone, and you talk to a girl that's gone through puberty and she has high levels of estrogen, what you'll hear is two completely different experiences of what it was like to come into womanhood or come into manhood.
Yeah.
Like my wife and I have talked about this a lot. I remember sharing, it was like, what was your experience like when you went through puberty and you started to like have a menstrual cycle? And she described this sort of like, and I can, I have her permission to talk about these things. I'm not like saying anything that she hasn't talked about.
Everybody must sign an NDA.
Yeah,
who's
right,
listening to this.
So she, she's like, well, I was very like emotional and like volatilely emotional. And she proceeded to reenact what she was like as a teenage girl talking to her dad,
Oh my
I was
gosh.
like, holy crap, man. Like, that's terrifying, And for me, it was like, I'm getting random boners on the bus and in classes and just like hard-ons everywhere. And I want to punch holes in walls.
Taking longer showers.
For no reason, voices cracking. And so I do think that these things sometimes play into it, and I mean, to vilify a sex hormone is just the most fucking absurd thing to me. It's
like, no offense, James Cameron. Like, if you're listening to this, much love your work.
Yes. I'm going to go see
That
Avatar
just felt
soon.
really, in Avatar, tremendous. The messaging from Avatar, love. I just felt like that feels virtue signaling. There's so much, we don't have to get into this, but I just need to make this statement, which is there's so much virtue signaling and presentation of virtuosity that it actually almost is completely losing its meaning. I was thinking that the other day when I was seeing something that Justin Trudeau did again, which that's a whole podcast.
You love him, don't you?
You're going
to be interviewing him soon.
I have a lot of opinions and thoughts and feelings about him, but I will never let him steal my joy. I was just like, it doesn't mean anything anymore. It's so void of depth and realness, just like these types of signals, even like I'm getting that, like I'm starting to feel that way. This might be a controversial statement, but I'm starting to feel that way about all the government virtue signaling about climate. Like there's just part of it I don't trust. Of course, I care about the planet. I love trees. I want to be all part of restoration of the earth. And we do exploit and extract 100%.
Yeah.
But part of it feels agenda-y, and it's very profit-driven. But let's get back to men.
Well, I think that on that note, it's become socially and culturally acceptable to denigrate and demonize whatever you believe to be the problem. And so for some people, men or masculinity is the problem, right? Or the patriarchy, right? As just a label is the problem. And so whenever you look at somebody and say, or look at something and say, that's the problem, we've almost entered into this space where then it becomes okay for you to be violent towards that thing or that person or that entity, or to completely disrespect and denigrate it. And so I think, James Cameron is just a good example of somebody who's fallen into this trap. I mean, imagine saying that like estrogen is something that you need to extract from your body as a man. I mean, that would just, we wouldn't socially allow that. It'd be like, that'd be preposterous.
It's also just so ridiculous.
Yes.
Like, to me, it's just like, it's not even grounded in what that tells me is that, and this might not be true for him, but my thought on that would be that person doesn't actually understand why men are the way they are.
Yes.
Or why people can be that way. But let's say, like, why men can be destructive or fucked up or shoot up schools and stuff like that, right? These are all realities. That's not women going and doing that. So it's like, it's not testosterone's fault. It's like Gabor Mate's new book, The Myth of Normal. Where he says, like, all these are symptoms of the problem with an environment.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and we're not paying... The canaries in the coal mine, they were going off a while ago.
Yep.
And now, like, we have more autoimmune, more everything, obesity, like all these things. And we have all these ways that we treat the symptoms and do drugs to eat sugar. Everything is monetized on this inability to confront and to blame a hormone, as opposed to, actually, it's kind of fucked up right now. The world, I think everyone's kind of feeling like, if you watch the news all the time, I don't recommend that, but if you did, you're not going to love life.
Yes. And, I think Look, I think where always stand is to try and be a voice for a return to, and when I say return, I don't mean a going backwards historically,
Yeah.
but a return to in the sense of finding what that looks like in our culture and our society, a return to the reverence and the honoring of the sacredness of men and women and masculinity and femininity as something that isn't dangerous or volatile or hostile or bad or wrong or less than or any of those things. And, people can have differing opinions about what that looks like, and I'm all for that. But
Yeah.
I think that any time that we take a fundamental component of our reality, like being a man or being a woman or masculine or feminine, these energies, these polarities have been around forever, and they've been a staple part of every religion, every society, everything,
Every animal,
every
right?
animal,
Like how the
right? I mean,
universe,
it
flowers,
just
like,
exists, right?
yeah.
That polarity is a part of it. And so to sort of tie this in to what I write about sometimes and talk about is like everything has a shadow, we as individuals have a shadow, a sort of darkness. Culturally, there's a shadow. Politically, there's shadows. Even in religions, there's often a shadow. I mean, Osho, if you ever watched that documentary Wild Wild Country, I mean, there's an individual whose shadow just became who he was, right? He's sort of wearing the
Driving a Rolls.
Rolexes and having 42 Rolls Royces and all the shit and the shenanigans that came out of that. And so I think from a more individual level and then a social level, it's like we have to be willing to look at our own shadow. We have to be willing to look at, hey, I've been hurt by men. And I get that, because a huge reason why I do the work that I do right now is because I also was hurt by men. It doesn't mean I wasn't hurt by women, or heartbroken or any of those things, but I was hurt by men as well, And I start off in my book, I say, a man's work begins in pain. That's the first line of the whole book. And I talk about that because I do think that unequivocally, our work as men right now within our culture and our society, we're being called to address our own pain. And
Agreed.
That we can find purpose in that, we can find meaning, we can find value, but also that when we go on that journey, we can return to culture, society, and our families and be of more contribution to them. And that there's an intrinsic value in that. But if we hate who we are, if we've grown up in an environment where we're told, men are all cheaters, men are rapists, men are pieces of garbage, men are just violent and abusive, then it's very hard to reconcile with who you are when who you are and what you've been told is that you are fundamentally broken or flawed.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of men are carrying around this notion that they need to get away from masculinity and that they need to get away from being a male, when there's nothing inherently wrong with those things. It's how you carry them. It's how you present yourself within them. And I think what a lot of men are actually dealing with is that they are carrying a pain, a charge, and an intensity within them that no one's really taught them how to deal with.
Yeah.
And the modern rhetoric and solution to that is just be more vulnerable. And that is true sometimes, but it has some limitations, which we can talk about at some point. But I do think that in many ways, whether you hear men talking or you hear women talking or anything in between, what you'll generally hear is a call from men to address their pain. That's the general notion of like men, the saying, hurt people hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, well, if men are causing a lot of the pain and the hurt that's happening within our world, then they're probably hurting. And we should probably give them the tools and the resources to work on that hurt and that pain. Like when I wrote this book and I brought it out, I remember having calls. I had calls with two of the biggest publishing houses in America. And they both said the same thing, which is, we love your concept, we love your work, we love the idea for this book, but men don't buy self-help books. They don't buy self-development books. And I was like, well, maybe you're not printing stuff that they give a shit about.
Right.
Like maybe you're not actually producing content that speaks to men, and that you're giving them something that's telling them how they should be or how they should operate and how they should sort of fit into this more feminine oriented way of being. Because a lot of I might get slack for even saying this, but I can feel it coming.
I think there's a few slacks already.
Yeah.
Spot, so.
But I think that in many ways, what has happened in our culture is that we've all seen that men are struggling, that they're suffering, that they're in decline. Less men are going to college, more men are living at home, less men are in the workforce than ever before, less men than ever before are sexually intimate with a partner between the ages of 18 and 30. It's something like 27% of men, Mark, between 18 and 30 are not sexually active. They're not in a relationship. And it's up 3 times it's up 3 times from 2010.
That makes sense. Since porn mainstreamed.
Right. So as we see men struggling and suffering, a lot of the solution that's pressed out into our modern dialogue is a very female-centric way of solving the problem. It's like, well, men just need to be more vulnerable. They need to be more emotional. They need to talk more.
Become women.
Yeah, they need to become more.
And I don't mean that as women are amazing.
Yes.
And the way that
I agree.
Women
I love
communicate
women.
and make their way through the world, I agree. That would be a less destructive way of being, 100%. And I'm curious, like you said about this charge, right? Like pain being I love that because I agree with that women try to commit suicide more, but men are more successful. So more men kill themselves.
Yeah, I mean,
because we choose guns.
We're recording
jumping
this
off buildings.
Like 2 days after Twitch took his life.
Yeah, which is wild, and which I know has affected a lot of people because outwardly presenting was a source of joy.
Yeah.
And I don't know, obviously I don't know him personally, so I don't know what he was like in his day-to-day, like if he wasn't actually happy.
Yeah.
But the way that he brought a lot of joy to people's lives, and I think so much of the male experience is to silently suffer, which is, I find it hard sometimes to bring my needs or my emotional needs forward in my relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Because the world doesn't say, men, bring your emotional needs forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the strange sort of paradox or trap that men are in is that what relationship and the world most needs from them is the thing that the world says you should not have if you want to be a man. It's in contrast to the definition, the sort of inherited definition of masculinity.
Yeah.
So you have to rebel against what you've been taught and abandon the definition, which is actually healthy, which is liberating in every way.
Yeah.
And I think everyone goes through that no matter their gender. But also, that is the thing that will most connect you to your family and your partner and your community. But also there's a lack of trust when men step into emotion. So it's like...
That's like Brene Brown. I mean, Brene Brown talked about that in Daring Greatly, where she said we put men into a double bind where we tell them, and I put this passage in the book because I thought it was so important. She said we put them on this sort of spotlight where we said, we want you to open up, we want you to be vulnerable. But then when men are open and vulnerable, it's often mocked, rejected, they're shamed for it. And not just by men, by women as well. I mean, you look at, again, love him or hate him, right? Regardless of what your perspective is on him, somebody like Jordan Peterson, who is oftentimes very emotionally raw when he's talking.
He cries a lot.
And he cries and he gets fiery about stuff and angry and whatnot. But if you remove your perspective about him, about whether you agree with his opinions and whatnot, what you'll notice is that here's a man who is respected by a lot of people, not respected by some, who gets emotional and then is publicly crucified for it.
Yeah.
CNN, MSNBC, people on Twitter just destroying him for being emotional. Oh, look, Jordan Peterson's crying again. Right? So, and the context for it is that he's always feeling a sense of empathy and compassion for somebody. I do think that most men know that there's a risk involved with being vulnerable. They know that. They know that they risk losing their partner. They know that they risk losing the respect of the, if it's a heterosexual relationship, of the woman that they're with. They know that they risk being ostracized or made fun of by people around them. So there's a very real risk for men to open up, and I think a lot of guys know that. Generally speaking, what we've done is we've had a culture within male culture that, if you look throughout history, has made it possible for men to share the depths of their being, to talk about their challenges, to talk about their problems, to talk about their pain, to have elders within the culture that are supporting them in releasing their grief or releasing the trauma of having lost a child or a parent or, some opportunity or something that meant something to them. And instead, what we've replaced it with, and I talk about this in the book, is this notion within masculine culture that you become a stronger man through suppression, that strength equals suppression, that the more that you can stuff shit down, the stronger you'll be. And I bought into that for a long time. You know, I didn't tell anybody what was going on in my life. And I ended up in a terrible situation, you know, where I had been hiding my own pain, my own trauma, the abuse that I experienced as a kid, and my actions, you know, my infidelities. I cheated in every relationship that I was in because I was hurting, because I was lost, because the only value and excitement and joy that I really found was in these affairs. And it led to my life completely falling apart, you know? And so if you had met me in that phase of my life, I probably would have presented a lot like Twitch. You know, I was very happy on the outside. It looked like I had a great life. I had a great relationship. I was traveling the world. I had the motorcycle and the Mustang and, you know, all the things. But behind the scenes, I was deeply depressed. I was abusing substances. I was abusing pornography. I was womanizing and sleeping around and being dishonest and out of integrity. And all that came because no one in my life, no one in my childhood, and it makes me emotional because I know how many men struggle with this. No one in my life showed me what to do with that pain, with the hurt that I'd been carrying around. No one told me, like, it's okay for you to bring these things forward. And when I say that specifically, I mean no man was in my life because there was an absence of masculinity. There was an absence of fatherhood in my life that was deeply damaging to me. And I think, you know, I write about it in the book as well, is that there's a kind of like a plague of absent fathers within our culture. And that absence creates a hole within a lot of children that they don't know what to do with, at least for me. You know, and I think for a lot of men that I've worked with over the last decade, I've worked with tens of thousands of men now, they carry within them this really deep pain of being neglected by the man that they ultimately wanted to be around, or abandoned by him, or abused by him, or to watch him live a half meaningful life, you know? And so I think in some ways that's part of the other call, is to not abandon ship on masculinity or being a man, but actually to turn towards the healing that's being asked of us. What do we need to face? What pain, what suffering, what darkness do we actually need to face in order to reconcile our relationship with our masculinity and claim it and own it so that it's safe and it's healthy and it's potent in a way that contributes to culture and society rather than causing it to be a threat.
One of the greatest green flags in relationship is if someone has really nice sheets, right? Like, we all value sleep, of course, and we value feeling comfortable when we're in bed, and that's imperative. And cozier sheets are my favorite sheets ever. I've loved this product since I discovered them, which is about 5 years ago. They've been on Oprah's favorites list for 4 years in a row. Cozier sheets are softer than cotton. They're incredible. They're temperature regulating, so that means they keep you cool and comfortable all night long. And they believe in their product so much that they have a 10-year warranty on all of them. And they have a 100-night sleep test. So that means that if you're like, I want to try these sheets, I want to see if these sheets really live up to the joy and excitement Mark has for them, they do. You get a 100-night sleep test, so you get to try for 100 nights. If you don't love them, you can send them back for a full refund. Because Cozy Earth loves that I love these sheets, and they want you to experience them, I've just hooked you up with a 40% off site-wide discount. All you got to use is the code GROVES at checkout. So just my last name at checkout. You get 40% off all their stuff. Go get these sheets. They're incredible. Go to cozyearth.com and use the code GROVES at checkout for 40% off. That's beautiful. This reorientation, instead of trying to eradicate or erase masculinity, actually heal.
Yeah.
Which, you know, if masculinity needs healing, femininity needs healing, you know, and I just mean that if one is wounded, the other is.
Totally.
Because in order for one to be wounded, the other has to be wounded. Like, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's fascinating sort of evolutionarily that I wonder at what moment, and I think we're still in it, but at what moment we sort of woke up to the being empathic to the way that evolution drove war and survival and like, the true instincts, that I think we're at battle with sometimes, is like using conscious choice versus following just the like desire, right?
Right.
Like, oh, I have butterflies with that person. It's like, well, you could still choose not to be with them, right?
Yeah.
Like there's
or to text them or to, hit them up on Instagram or whatever
right.
it is.
You don't have to swipe right to everything.
Yeah.
And I guess that's more of that sort of chasing, but appealing to what feels like an evolutionary drive versus what is actually good for us. And I think of like with that spider. I think it's is it a spider? Maybe the praying mantis that after it bangs, then the woman eats the
Black
man's.
widow.
Yeah, the black widow. And at some point, if the black widow develops empathy,
consciousness,
and consciousness beyond what it has,
yeah,
it will be like, fuck, I just ate Bob's head. At what point were we just going about being a species that we woke up to the impact of just being a species, to what it was evolutionarily serving us, like it still maybe 50 years ago, it served us to send only men to war. And it served us to send men to die. And so the things that we actually wanted from men, which is a lack of emotionality, but access to rage, served us. And that served us tribally when we were at war, that, and I guess still on some level can. Although I think that's shifting how we handle conflict and all that. I mean, ideally, obviously not everywhere and not all right now. But I wonder, like, that shift of, I think we're still in an awakening. Well, we're in a massive up-leveling right now. But I wonder at what point we're all sort of waking up to the impact. Like, we grew up often with fathers or fathers' fathers who didn't, there was no space for emotionality. They're working on a farm 18 hours. They're in a factory. They're just they're covered in coal.
Yeah.
Like, they're just trying to survive.
I can just hear, for some reason, I can only hear Donald Trump saying, clean coal. Clean coal.
I mean, he's a good example of a lot of things.
Have you seen his NFTs that just came out?
I saw that he just dropped them, and he said, I'm one of the best presidents, better than Lincoln.
Better than Lincoln, better than Washington. He's got him and the superhero. But I think, here's a character that is so polarizing when it comes to men and masculinity. So revered by some, and I think it's a little bit different than men and masculinity, because I think in many ways he is more an embodiment of dictator and leader. I don't think that that's actually about being a man or being masculine. I think that's more about what it means to be a leader within the world, and I think it's a little bit different. But he's such a fascinating character. I mean, just as like a psychological study.
I agree. Like, a lot of people, I was reading a funny tweet or meme the other day where it said, remember when you could disagree with a friend and you'd still be friends?
Yes.
Did you see that one?
I don't know if I saw it, but I've talked about that. It was like
5 years ago, I knew people who voted for Trump, and I'm Canadian, so I was kind of separate from it. I was like, oh, I can't believe, because that was classic Canadian too. Like, we don't have our shit, and now we got a bunch of it. But it's like classic, American, voting for Trump, blah, blah, judgy, so this is not me today.
Yeah.
But it ended up creating this sort of polarity of, there's something about Trump that instead of being like, you voted for Trump, you are all these other things.
Right.
You voted for Biden, you're all these other things. You voted for Trudeau, you're all these, whatever, right? Like, it's all the same shit on all the sides.
Yeah.
But what I think is interesting is if we start to orient towards that from a place of, okay, tell me what is it that appeals to you? Because his polarity appeals to people, and he appeals to the like person who feels like they haven't been seen, heard, loved, have space in the world. And whether they're valid to feel that way or not, I'm not getting into that debate. But my curiosity is, what is it about these different movements or these different political things? And coming back to the idea of men is, what are our outlets to even, like, when you talk about men and men's work and us turning towards healing this pain, which is much like healing this crazy divide that exists politically, policy-wise, right? Like, I just feel like division has just been amplified.
Yeah, massively.
Yeah. And it's like how, I think the same thing as like wanting to sit with love with someone who we don't agree with. How do we do that between men and women? How do we do, you know what I mean? It's all the same. It's all, how do we build a fucking bridge?
Right.
And like women aren't going to save us. You know, they've been over-functioning a lot to sort of carry the families. And you said there's an absence of parents.
Yeah.
And even when men are there, they're not
fully
there
there.
Emotionally.
Yeah.
And there's evolutionary, political, cultural reasons. How do we even, like that journey, how do we even begin or continue? Like, what does it look like? Solve the world's problems, if you wouldn't mind. We're recording this and not drinking, so we'll remember, which is really beautiful. Neither of us drink, so this
sober
is perfect.
for years now.
Yeah.
I mean, well, just not to go too far past the Trump NFTs and cards. I think what was interesting when I saw them was him dressed up as a superhero,
dude.
You know,
a superhero. I was like,
a buff superhero. I was like, dude, you
buff superhero.
You know, like, come on, man.
With a full head of hair,
with a full head of hair. But I think, you know, in our Western culture, I think that we're going through a period of sort of dissolving and falling apart, you know, and so older structures are breaking down. But I think that in many ways, what I see happening is in the absence of fatherhood, there's this yearning for that masculine energy. It doesn't go away, right? I remember being a boy at, 6, 7 years old, and my parents had divorced when I was 3, and I would cry all the time at night, trying to get my mom to call my dad and trying to find ways for me to go and see him and be around him. And so there was this void within me that was so visceral and so painful that to have him not around, like, left this deep scar within me that just always felt open, this wound that always felt open, that I could just feel constantly. And so when I look at our world today, what I see is a manifestation of that absent fatherhood just running rampant within our culture. And that's why I say there has to be some form of return to masculinity so that we can honor, that men can honor themselves in a way to be present fathers, because it's such an important role. And so I think people like Jordan Peterson, as an example, or even Donald Trump to some extent, become this kind of archetypal father figure that gets lifted up within the public square, within the public dialogue, because people are so hungry for father energy. They're just so hungry for fatherhood that to have somebody like Peterson say, make your bed, which is so simple, right? But it's order, it's clear, and it's just very direct. And so I think there's a lot of people that are like, I want that. I need that energy in my life. I need that clarity and that assertiveness and that direction. So I think, for many of the men that are in modern culture, part of the work that I do, why I do, is to give a direction of, here's a way for you to find fulfillment. Here's a way for you to contribute to your family in a different way. That's not just about earning money. That's about showing up with presence and being grounded and not passing on your trauma or your pain to your kids or your friends or your wife or, whoever it is around you that you really love. And I think that's meaningful in many ways. We've talked about, I think we both interviewed Francis Weller, and, he talks about this extensively, about how this is the role that initiation used to play for men, was that in some way, shape, or form, it would bring a man through an experience of powerlessness so that he understood how to be responsible for his power. Right? So,
like, he's brought to his knees in some way.
Yeah, but
through initiation in the tribe.
Initiation in the tribe amongst other men, a part of the village.
But designed.
Right? And so
which is so powerful.
My theory is
contained initiation.
My theory is that, we as young boys and young men need these, what I call little I initiations, to prep us for the capital I initiation that only life can bring us. The moments in life where you just are taken out by the knees, where the heartbreak is so raw that you don't know how to deal with it, where the person that you thought you're going to spend your life with suddenly is like, I'm out and I'm leaving you. Or you lose a parent, or you lose a child, or your health starts to falter, or the career that you've built falls apart. It's in those moments where we feel where life literally puts us in the most powerless, helpless, grief-oriented position that we've had some training as men to know how to face and confront that. And I think that that's part of what's missing within our culture is having men who have kind of gone through this journey of saying, okay, I've walked into the cave of my own bullshit, of my own pain, my own suffering, the bad decisions that I've made, the addictive behaviors, the bullying that I received at school, the heartbreak, the infidelities. I've walked through those things. And I've come out the other side much more competent and capable and fulfilled and whole. Because that's, if you look at any good myth, that's what happens, is that by going into the darkness, you can find some kind of gold. And what we're talking about is psychological gold, right?
Yeah.
The gold of a deeper sense of authenticity, the gold of wholeness, and it's not that that's a destination to be sort of achieved and arrived at, but that walking that path, that the journey towards that is deeply rewarding and fulfilling, and that there's purpose and meaning in that. You hear people, there's like 300,000 books about purpose, like 300,000 books on Amazon, all about purpose. A lot of guys come to me and they're like, I don't know what my purpose in life is, and I don't know what I should be doing. And I usually say, start with your pain. Start with the thing that feels really hard for you to look at. And in the process of doing that, you will show yourself physically, emotionally, and psychologically that you are capable of doing the hard thing that you didn't think you were able to do before. And that level of psychological competence is so valuable in our life as men. When a lot of guys say, I don't feel confident, that's what they're actually saying, is I don't feel competent enough or capable enough to face my inner dialogue, my inner critic, the fact that I beat the shit out of myself constantly. They're afraid of these parts that live within them, and they don't really want to face them. They aren't willing to face them. And for me, those are the things that in my life fundamentally held me back. I had honestly the worst inner dialogue. I was more abusive to myself internally than anybody had ever been to me externally. And so I had to reconcile with the fact that there was this part of me that was very vicious and hostile. And I do this exercise at men's weekends where I'll get two men to sit across from each other. I'll get all the men at the men's weekend to sit across from each other. And I'll say, write down what your inner dialogue sounds like, your inner critic, when it's being the harshest with you. And then once they're all done, I'll say, okay, one of you is going to go first. And you're going to speak to that other man from that inner dialogue, from that inner critic. And the resistance that most men have is so like visceral, right? They're like, I don't want to talk to that guy like that. Like, he doesn't deserve it. He's a good guy. I love him. It's like, I've come to get to know him. Like, I don't want to hurt him like that.
I would never speak to
I would
someone
never
else.
speak to somebody else like that. And it's like, but the truth that most men are living is that they are living in a kind of prison internally, one where the guards, the inner critic, are violent, where they are literally violent towards themselves.
Like psychological abuse to themselves.
And a lot of it's because, again, we don't have this culture of being with men in a way where our anger is acceptable, where we can understand that there's sometimes value in anger, right? David White, famous poet, I think you know him, he said that anger is the deepest form of care.
And you need access to it.
And you need access to it,
That's what changes the world.
So, I think...
And ourselves.
I think part of this is that there's kind of like a reclamation process that men need to turn towards masculinity and turn towards healing and what that might look like for them, and go on a journey of asking themselves what that means to them, what masculinity is for them, and how they can express that within their lives, versus seeing it as the James Cameron notion of that's the thing that needs to be extracted and killed off within you and inside of you.
Which is just more of the compartmentalizing, more of the imprisoning.
Yes.
Which is, again, the problem. Yeah. Because it's like, well, if the world's not going to welcome you, perceptionally, men's groups can. that are based on actually being places. I think AA really modeled, like, was maybe one of the first places that really said, okay, well, everyone has the right to tell their story, and actually not just the right, we need you to tell it.
Yeah.
And that's part of the healing. Like, I remember going to AA with a good friend of mine, and I was like, this is like TED Talks. Like, it was so inspiring. It was actually pretty funny because my friend was like, okay, listen, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to bring someone today, but come and they're going to ask you, they might ask you if you want to share. And your answer has to be, I'm just here to listen. And I was like, yeah, I got this. Like, I was made to be an actor. And then I was sitting there, and like, there's 100 people in the crowd, and the guy looks over at me like, hey, do you want to share? And I was like, I like look around, I'm like, who, me? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, I'm just here to listen. It was the worst. And my friend was like, you're awful. You said you had that. Anyways, I found it to be such a powerful and potent. I hadn't actually heard men express pain on that level, and a group of both men and women be just like, we love you so much. Like, you're safe here. And I think of the initiatory process. I can't remember. Is it the Maasai people? I can't remember. But where they actually take, I think it's at 13, and they take and they paint I think it's the boys, but maybe boys and girls. They paint them black, and then they're to be ignored that day in the tribe. And then they're given a new name.
Afterwards,
And they're now men. I think it is just the boys. I can't remember though. But in it, what was fascinating is that now what comes with the initiation, the contained initiation, where I can't remember the other parts of it, is I now have a responsibility. I'm no longer a boy. I now have a responsibility to the tribe and to the people.
The collective,
Yeah, and I think you're dead on in saying that. That is missing. Most of our fathers haven't been through contained initiations. I mean, Francis Weller talks about how we live in an immature culture, like an adolescent culture, which is very true. And maybe that's why we eradicated or attempted as colonizing people to eradicate indigenous ways, which was very much about initiation and reverence for plants and the salmon and all that kind of stuff. It all seems to come back to the same. It's like the colonizing of ourselves, of our essence. So in men's work, like this, so can you tell people the title of your book and all that stuff? It's
just called Men's Work.
Perfect.
It's called Men's Work, and then the subtitle is Facing Your Darkness, Ending Self-Sabotage, and Finding Freedom.
Perfect. So everybody, go pick it up. For men and women?
It's for men and about men, but I think that any woman who reads the book is going to. So my editor was a woman, and she was like, I hope that every woman buys this book because I have learned so much about my boyfriend and my brother and my father, and she ended up sending them copies of the books. And so, I wrote it specifically to be from men, for men, and about men.
Makes sense, yeah.
But every woman that has picked it up and read it has absolutely loved it and learned a ton, because first off, I want to clarify, I'm not telling men how to be. I'm not telling them what masculinity is. And I'm not telling them, here's how you should treat women, which I think is what most books for men usually do. They do one of those things. Here's how you should be a man. Here's what masculinity is, or here's what women want. And I do none of those three things in the book. It really is a process of a kind of like self-guide that a man can walk himself through to essentially lead himself more effectively, to learn to lead himself more effectively. And he might learn, about who he becomes in relationship to women, and he might learn some of those pieces about why he becomes needy or avoidant or shut down. And women are certainly going to learn, I would say, at least based on the women that have read the book so far, are going to learn a lot about why we as men are the way we are, because of culture, because of the male pressures that we put on ourselves, and just, how we as men operate and think.
I think that's super valuable because for me, just off the top of my head, I've consumed 3 books that were specifically written for women.
Totally.
And they were so helpful in understanding why women have a challenging time accessing anger and stuff like that. And I think to It just gives us more compassion when we're in relation to,
Yeah.
you know, like in reading and being part of your work, but also being in a men's group with you. I get to be broadened through the experience of what you teach, because then even being in relationship with you, but in the other men in the group and just with other men, with my brother, with my dad, there is more compassion. And I know when we, I think when we're talking about starting to turn towards taking responsibility for our lives and claiming purpose, turning towards our pain, I think no matter the person we're talking about, there is first a part, and maybe we get stuck here in this part of, but the world did this to me. Like, I think for a lot of men, that's often like, yeah, but the world says I'm toxic. The world, my dad was a piece of shit. My this, my that. Masculinity is bad. We're all rapists. We're all murderers. Like, what's the point? And it's like, we all have traumas occur to us, some much more significant than others. And I think often what feels when we start to say, I'm going to take responsibility for everything in my life, there's this idea that is the negation of the pain that we've had. Like, but it isn't my fault. And it's like, you're right. Actually, it isn't. And maybe some really bad things have happened to you due to a lot of things. But you're the one who's got to do the, cook it. You're the one who's got to change. And there's also, when you decide to do that as a person, but I think, as a man, my experience in that is there's an exhale that happens, because it's like, oh yeah, like my partner's not going to make me read a book or trick me into listening to another podcast.
Or
I'm
tell me
going
who
to
I
do
should
that.
be. Yeah.
Right. And I think sometimes our love for somebody can be enough, much like in addiction, where it's like you get the intervention and you're like, holy fuck. Like, there's so much love present here. Like, why is it not present here?
Right.
So yeah, can you speak to what you think about what I just said? There's no question in that. It's just a request. I'm making a bid.
I'm making a bid, yeah. Just a few statements and some observations. So 2 things. One, if we hold the belief, and this is just the framework that I have, because I come from a very Jungian framework. And by the way, Jung had a heavy influence on AA. The founder of AA, I believe it was his brother or he himself, had worked with Carl Jung in sessions and was working with him specifically on his addiction. And Jung said, you don't have a problem, like you essentially, like, you're never going to heal what is ailing you until you come into relationship with God, or until you write your relationship with something that's bigger than you.
Yeah.
And so when we have that kind of wound of life did this to me, in some ways that's like saying something bigger than me is always going to come and fuck my shit up. It's always going to get in the way. And whether you want to call that God, whether you want to call that life, whether you want to call that source or universe or whatever word you put on that, there's a relationship there. And so what you're saying is, I don't have a right relationship with the energy or the source that's bigger than me, that brought me here. And that's, that is a very specific wound to carry. So when we stop blaming the nameless, we can actually take accountability for the self. And there's a kind of empowerment and an autonomy and sovereignty that comes along with saying, all right, God, all right, life, all right, source, I've been blaming you for a long time. I've been a victim to what I thought was your circumstances. And rather than continuing to blame you, I'm going to take ownership over what I can possibly do about it.
Yeah.
And we start to draw some lines around what Stephen Covey called the circle of influence, right? What we can influence and what we can't influence.
I forgot about the circle.
Right? And it's just this very simple model where we can start to see, can I do something about this? Can I affect change in this? Can I take ownership over this? Or am I fixating on something that I have zero control over? Which is where a lot of us as men struggle, is that we've been taught to over-index the rational mind. And so we think that every single freaking problem in our life can be solved with what's between our ears. And we disconnect from the wisdom and the intelligence of our body, of our heart, of our gut. And that gut intelligence, that intuitive intelligence, is our connection to the world around us, right? That's our direct felt experience. We have to sort of get right with that. And then I think the other thing that you said that stood out was this notion of, I don't trust men, I don't trust masculinity, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that a lot of men do carry that wound around men or around masculinity. And the challenge becomes
unconsciously.
100%.
I didn't even know.
100%. But I think the main problem that I think all men need to come into contact with that have that wound is that if you do not trust men fundamentally, if you really get honest with yourself and you're like, actually, I don't trust men, and I don't trust the masculine. Well, you're a man. And so what you're really saying is,
Right.
I don't trust me. Fundamentally, I do not trust me. When push comes to shove,
Something wrong with me.
there's something wrong with me. So that man that's carrying that belief, men are bad, men are dangerous, men are this, men only hurt women, there's a rejection of who they naturally are at their core. Yeah. There's a rejection of what they are at their core. And that rejection will naturally create this kind of dissonance within them. And when you really start to question some of their actions, specifically within relationship, what it will really come down to and what they'll almost always talk about is, I don't trust myself. I just don't trust myself. Well, why not? Because I don't like myself. Well, how come? Well, because I don't like who I am as a man, or I don't like who I am as a father or as a husband or as a partner, right? Well, how come? And then you just dig a little bit deeper, and what you'll find is, well, I was, my father left me, or I didn't get time with him.
Like a lack of worth.
A lack of worth, right? Or my mom constantly told me how bad men were. She constantly told me, not to be like my father. That's something that a lot of men hear.
So common.
And so what are they doing? They try and construct a personality that is in some ways almost devoid of masculinity,
Like it's like trying to put a compartment again, that compartmentalization. It's like putting it in a box,
right?
Putting it in the closet and being like, we don't have to worry about that. I'm a really nice guy.
Right. And then they become nice guys, and then they get pissed off at the women in their life for being assertive, for being direct, for having boundaries. They get reactive and needy for not expressing their own wants and needs, because they're operating from this place of, I'm deficient or defective. And I'm saying this all from personal experience, right? So I'm not talking about men in general. I'm actually talking about myself in my past and who I was. I want to make that super clear. So maybe I should just operate from that place. So I would come from that place when I was disliking my own masculinity, didn't trust men because men had hurt me. How I would operate with women in my life was, I'm going to hurt you. So you shouldn't be around me. And so I would do things to push them away, whether it was acting needy or constantly wanting their validation or sabotaging the relationship or whatever it was. And largely it had nothing to do with them. Some of the relationships weren't right, for sure. Some of them I definitely shouldn't have been in. But for the most part, I didn't know who I was, and I didn't trust who I was. And because I was carrying around this pain of, I was hurt by men and I don't trust men, it was very hard for me to simply settle in to the depth of experience of being a man, of being a man that a woman could trust. It was very uncomfortable to think I can be a man that's trustworthy.
Yeah.
Because all that I knew was men who were harmful or would abandon or were abusive. That's the framework that I had operated from. And so I had to get right with my relationship with men, and I had to heal that, and I had to forgive certain men, and I had to let go of the debt that I thought that they owed me, and I had to reconcile with the pain that I had caused as a man, the hurt that I had passed on to women through infidelities, through lies, through betrayals. That's a lot of work.
That's facing the darkness.
That's facing the darkness. Yeah.
And if you don't excavate that, like if you don't turn towards that and accept it, which isn't saying what you did was okay, because I think that's often confusing. It's like, well, if I turn towards it and I go, okay, well, I love this part of me, but this part of me has been destructive.
And it's still destructive. Yeah,
right.
It's still destructive.
And if you don't turn towards it, it will still unconsciously steer, because you'll be afraid to touch it all the time. And then it comes out in these weird, fucked up ways. But like, how do we ever, like, we try to soothe it with porn. We try to soothe it with these other things that, of course, we recognize in the sort of like post-ejaculatory wallowing.
Post-nut clarity.
Right.
Can we talk about
Post-nut clarity.
Can we talk about porn? Can we? Because I write about it in the book.
Yeah. I wanted to say though that like that's where our partnership needs us to go, because for the partnership to deepen, we have to confront those things, because what intimacy demands is all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so many men, when their partner, whether same gender or not, but especially women, when they're like, hey, like I want to talk about this, or I want to go to therapy, or like, hey, this behavior is destructive, or whatever, the men just like close down, shut down, do whatever. Hey, this is just life. Like if you don't, you knew what you're getting into, or whatever it is, which I'm sure that happens on the other side. But it's like then their partners leave them.
Yeah.
And then they're like, hey, I'm ready to do the work.
Yeah.
And it's like, don't wait for them, because by the time a person leaves you, a woman leaves you, she's already gone. Generally, not always, but generally.
But I think it's tough, because I think that a lot of, like, I was convinced that the only way change would occur is if I would bottom out. Like, I was convinced, Mark, that the only way change would happen in my life is I fucking rock bottom.
I'm going to rock bottom.
And I think a lot of men have that. A lot of men carry this idea, and they hold this belief in their head that they cannot change until something so monumental happens and blindsides them, right? So it's kind of, I call it like a pseudo initiation, a forced initiation, where they put themselves into this rock bottom position where things are so bad, where they've blown up their life, where they have to kind of recover from it, where they're so powerless and hurt that they then have to build from the wreckage. And so some men fundamentally believe, like I did, that they need to bottom out.
Why did you believe you needed to, like,
because I thought that's what I deserved. I thought it's what I deserved, right?
So
I thought I deserved.
Even though you're like, I could change right now.
Yeah.
You're like, I actually deserve.
Yes.
To potentially even be eradicated.
Yeah.
Like, it was their thoughts of needing to be exterminated, maybe the wrong word, but like,
no, I thought
like if I left the world won't be upset about it.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about taking my own life once or twice when I was younger. Once when I was like 14 and things were really bad, and my family system was. I felt lost in between my family systems. I grew up between two families, and I bounced back and forth. And my experience as a kid was that there was these two complete family systems that I didn't fit into, that I didn't belong in either of them.
Your parents divorced,
when I was 3,
married.
And then they married other people, and then they both had a daughter, and they both had a son. And so there was these two identical family systems.
Nuclear families
that I bounced between.
Yeah. Interesting.
And there was that moment, and then, when everything fell apart in my life, I didn't, my girlfriend found out I'd been cheating, and I was contemplating leaving my career, and the sort of facade that I had created that my life was so great just completely crumbled. And I didn't want anybody to know. I didn't want my friends to know. I didn't want my family to know. And so she moved out with one of her friends, and I packed up all my shit. I put it into a storage unit, and I went and lived in the back of my car. And I talk about it in the book. I talk about how, what I called sunrises in Chateau Walmart. Like waking up in the back of my 2007 Pontiac G5. This 2-door coupe that I had.
Not built for a 6'2".
No. Dude.
I'm 5'8" on a good day. And
it would not be comfortable.
I know. I slept in a car once in Banff after staying out, and that was not fun.
But, and so I contemplated it in that moment as well, because I don't know who said it, but somebody said suicide is the ultimate form of self-destruction. This desire to annihilation, to obliteration, to just not be here anymore. And I think I had gotten to this place where the image that I created and the facade I created had fallen apart. And what I was left with was just the hurt that I had been running from for so long. And
that you couldn't. There was no escape.
There was no avoiding it anymore. There was no avoiding it. My hope is that in men reading this book, that they stop the descent. They stop the descent. They challenge the notion that they have to implode their lives in order to create change. Change will require that things fall apart, for sure, but that just might be your old stories and narratives and beliefs. It doesn't have to be the entirety of your life. In that few weeks that I spent living on the back of my car, it was a very dark time. And I think I just came to, like, I remember this one night at the very end of it, laying in the back, looking out at the stars, blanket over top of me, you know, freezing my ass off.
The back seat of a two-door?
The backseat of a
Oof.
two-door coupe, and
Damn.
just contemplating whether I should end it or whether I should carry on. And thankfully, in some strange way, it was like the knowing that that this was where I was headed anyway, that this rock bottom was coming for years. There was almost some kind of salvation in that.
Like a relief?
Like a relief. Yeah,
Yeah.
like a sigh, like
You're like, I got here.
like I made it,
Wow.
you know? And it was like the car crash that I had been watching happening in slow-mo for years.
Yeah.
And so when the car crash happened, you know, it's almost like I just needed to be with the truth of the shit that I'd been running from for so long. And, you know, I ended up having conversations with men in my life after that. And thankfully I had a mentor in my life at that time. He was, you know, in his mid-70s. And I ended up spending 2.5 years working with him and learning about Jungian psychology and Gestalt and CBT and
So powerful.
and Buddhism. You know,
Yeah.
he ended up turning into like my like little Yoda, you know, this like little French Canadian Yoda that really like saved my life in a lot of ways, you know.
Yeah.
And in that apprenticeship, I got a sense of what it was like to be in relationship with a man who was an elder in a very healthy way, you know, where it wasn't about him necessarily. Even though the way it was set up is I would support him, you know, like I would pay him wherever I could for his time and for his help and for his mentorship. And then when I couldn't, he would ask me to chop wood and help with his asparagus farm
Yeah.
and, you know, stuff like that. And so, so I'm fortunate, but I think that a lot of men, when they don't tend to this wound and when they continue to pretend like the wound isn't there, there's this notion that it's noble to suffer in silence, and that
that actually is like contributing to
Yeah.
their masculinity.
yeah. And so, like
That's interesting. That's a tough.
in the book, I talk
place.
about the myth of male suppression, the myth of male separation, and this notion that if you can just separate as a man from your hurt, from your pain, from your anger, from your anxiety, from the shit that you don't like, right? Whatever it is internally that you don't like, if you just get far enough away from it, that will embolden you as a man. But what it actually does is just weaken you, right? Your capacity to be strong and confident as a man is actually in getting closer to the grief, closer to the hurt or the anger or the anxiety that you're experiencing. It's actually about learning to walk yourself and shepherd yourself towards those things that you're actually afraid of. We as men have a very peculiar relationship with our own fear. And so we often blind ourselves to the things that we're really afraid of. You know, I was afraid of my pain because I had seen in the past where it had taken hold of me to such a degree where I was a teenager where I contemplated taking my own life. And so I'd sort of been running from that for a long time. And so we have to be willing to move towards our fears psychologically, relationally, you know. I mean, the amount of men that come and work with me in relationship, what I'm usually looking for is, what are you afraid of?
Yeah.
And when you get down to it, a lot of us are just afraid of real intimacy because it's almost like we don't know how to be with the feminine aspects within ourselves, and to be with a beautiful feminine creature outside of us can be very terrifying, you know, because they can see us, you know, they can they can see when we're, you know, we're off, or they can feel into what's going on sometimes before we've even caught that.
I can't stand it sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, it's such a gift, but with every gift is because there's a call that's constantly there.
Yes.
You know, and it's beautiful. That's why I think relationships are kind of the ultimate container for growth. And there's nothing else that will consistently call you forward like that. Probably parenting too.
Jung said that marriage is the fastest horse to individuation, which means it's the fastest horse towards wholeness. And you can replace marriage with relationship, I think, within our modern culture. But yeah.
So earlier you were saying that we often think vulnerability is the path to men healing. Or like sharing how they feel. And you said something along the lines of, that's not totally true.
Mm.
And so I'm curious, what were your, because you said you were going to share what those were, and I was like, that's going to be a good one. I want to know. So yeah, what are your sort of further thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a chapter I talk about the myth of male vulnerability. And it's not that I don't think it's part of the equation. I just don't think that it's the cure-all solution that it's being presented as, right? I do think that a part of a man's work and journey is going to call him into transparency and to be open and to be vulnerable about those things, about his past, about his actions and his choices, about where he's struggling or suffering. I do think that there is merit in that, but I don't think that that's the only thing that men are dealing with. It's much more complex than that for a lot of guys. I think the first step, like again, I'll just talk about Jung because it's sort of like the framework that I usually operate from. He said that the first step in any therapeutic process is confession. And so I think that in order for a man to start his journey, there's some form of vulnerable confession or admission that he will have to undertake. And whether it's the admission that he's depressed or he's miserable at his work or he's unhappy in his marriage or that he's been unfaithful or that he's been, carrying around the betrayal and the hurt from his childhood or whatever it is, right? Whatever that admission is, I do think that that requires a certain level of vulnerability. I think after that, there are many different pieces that require that man that the work looks different after that. It's a process of looking at his relationship to men and masculinity, looking at the shadow of his father, looking at his relationship to women, and that a lot of what men are actually being asked to do is develop certain skills within themselves. Like for example, the example that I gave before of a man's inner critic, and how vicious he can be towards himself, and that exercise that I was talking about. Some men simply just haven't learned the skill of compassion, and that can be a skill that he can execute, that he can begin to actually build and develop within himself, that will serve him and his life in a very valuable way. And so I do think that some of it is about vulnerability. I think that's generally that's like front loaded, it's the beginning of a man's journey. And then I do think that there's some of it that requires him to be incredibly bold and courageous, to confront maybe the truth of the relationship that he had with his father, to step into spaces where he can communicate his grief to other men, to develop the skills within himself that will allow him to feel more competent and more fulfilled. I think that some men, like we live in a very domesticated society in modernity, right? Modernity sort of pitches this notion that you'll be happy if you can just relax into mediocrity.
Yeah.
If you can just let life happen to you.
Become a good provider.
Just because, yeah, that's it, right? And so I think the other part is that men, again, like I said in the beginning, men respond to calling. They respond to a call. And sometimes that's a very different frame than you just need to be vulnerable. For some men, it really is that they want to develop competency in something, whether that's competency within their body or within their mind, or developing
like creativity.
Yeah, like creativity and art form.
It could be martial arts.
Martial arts.
Which I think is a really powerful foundational method for a lot of men, because they learn order and power, but contained power. Yeah,
in a sort of directed way. So I think that certainly part of it is about revealing and vulnerability and authenticity, but that's not the whole thing. It's not the complete sort of arc of what a man's work will be. I think the other part is that, like I was saying, if you can develop certain skills in your life as a man, that can be very rewarding, because we as men do want to contribute. Men want to contribute to their family. They want to contribute to their friends and to society. And so being able to discern where you can contribute and what skills that you possess or want to cultivate so that you can contribute is deeply rewarding.
Yeah.
Like I've watched you as an example build this podcast and have these conversations, and you have doubled down on deepening your skill as an orator, something that you already were gifted at. Like I think I said before, like you just have this capacity and this ability to really speak to people in this wonderful way that people really hear and listen. But I've watched you actually deepen that skill. And from the outside, at least, and through our conversations, it's looked like you have been rewarded for that internally in terms of fulfillment and joy and satisfaction. And so I think a lot of men, also a part of their work is to be able to find capability within some of the skills that they can then contribute to life and the world and their family and the people around them, to find a sense of meaning and purpose. And that will broaden who they are, and it will broaden their perspective on how they fit into the world, and that's an equal part of their healing. And we don't often look at it from that place, that developing competency in something is a very healing approach. If I love painting, but I suck at it, I can actually use painting as a modality for my healing, whether that's, psychologically, or just as a means of creative expression. And so as I develop that skill and as I develop competency in that area of painting, I will feel a much deeper connection to a sense of self-worth. And I think a lot of men that I've worked with over the years are walking around with very deep questioning, at the very least, and on the other end of the spectrum, a very deep wound within their sense of their own worth. And that's not necessarily about vulnerability. Part of it is, but the other part is really about competency and skill and discipline. And I think a lot of guys grew up like me, where I grew up that discipline is a form of punishment. And so I hated being disciplined. Like I just freaking hated it. And that left me feeling very challenged and incapable of being able to contribute to the things that mattered to me, or feeling confident in myself or respecting myself. And so writing my relationship with discipline and seeing it as something that's a practice versus something that's a punishment takes a tremendous amount of work, but it's also something that's incredibly valuable. So I think those are just some of the other things. And then the last thing that I would say, because I don't want to skip this, is in order for a man to feel safe with the world, and more specifically with women or the feminine in the world, he has to understand how to create safety within himself and within the feminine within himself, right? To be able to be compassionate, nurturing for himself, empathetic towards himself, to be able to forgive himself. The amount of men that I've worked with over the years who have come to me, and they don't say it directly, but I can hear it in what they're talking about, is so many men are struggling to forgive themselves, to know how to do that, to give themselves the gift of forgiveness. And so the degree to which a man can deal with and navigate his own feminine nature will equal the degree and the capacity that he has to be with women, to treat them well, to be safe for them. If a man doesn't feel safe within himself, how in the actual hell is he supposed to feel safe for a woman?
Yeah, like he doesn't know how to access it.
That's right.
So he can't model it.
Yes.
It would just be fake.
Yeah. So, in the book, I talk about not trying to get it right with women, not trying to chase women, not trying to figure women out, because that's generally what we do. Like, we're very external, right? And it's like, oh, I love this woman, I got to figure her out, or I got to, like, how do I get things right for her? Or how do I, prove myself to her? And so we go on this externalized adventure where we're trying to figure her out or win with her or whatever the case may be. And I think one of the biggest things is that it's not about her. Like in a heterosexual relationship, like she's not the journey, she's not the prize, she's not the thing for you to win or to figure out. It's actually you. It's your ethics, your morals as a man. It's you that's the journey, and that the sooner that you can turn towards yourself and ask yourself the question, who do I become in relationship with this woman? Not who is she and how do I figure her out and how do I get it right with her and how do I make her happy, but actually, who do I become? Do I become anxious? Do I become needy? Do I become avoidant and shut down? the sooner that we can turn towards the truth of who we become in relationship, the sooner that we can see whether or not that's the right relationship to be in. And the sooner that we can become someone that is safe for that other person to be the fullest expression of themselves. And when you really listen, I think, and I could be wrong about this, but when I really listen to women describe what it is that they're wanting, generally speaking, what I'm hearing is women are wanting the safety to express, the safety to be seen, the safety to be understood, the safety to be heard, and to know that it's not going to be met with complete shutdown or avoidance or hostility and volatility. And so our work as men is to see if we can carve ourselves into a kind of container that can sometimes hold what our kids are going through or what society is trying to sort out or and when I say hold, I don't mean to take on and like grunt down on, and hold it within ourselves, but to allow that energy to penetrate us and move through us. And we do that by understanding, who do I become in this relationship? Rather than trying to fix her or solve her or figure her out, we actually look at ourselves and we try and figure ourselves out, and we try and get ourselves closer to our own sense of morality and ethics and how we actually want to operate as a man with integrity and congruency and alignment. And when we can do that, we not only respect ourselves much more quickly, but the women that we're with will respect us. And generally speaking, women want to be with men that they respect, period.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think great male friendships and great romantic partnerships, and I'd say great parents. And probably children and cousins and all that. But like the relationships that have truly transformed me and continue to are the ones that mirror back my potential and where I'm not meeting it. I think that's the beautiful container of a men's group or good male friends.
Yeah.
And that's different than what you get from your romantic partner. Often the conversations are more assertive, not always. A guy can be assertive. But also in romantic partnership, I totally agree with you. Like when we move into being in integrity with our values, our morals, whatever that means for us, there's a trust within ourselves, a groundedness, a rootedness. And you said that change from going like, how do I get her? Which, oh my God, that's like my teens and 20s.
Me too.
It's like, how do I get her?
Chase.
Right, which is like not grounded, it's contrived, it's manipulative. And again, like none of that is intentional. It's just like what you witness. It's because there's not a lot of that. But when you see men who are grounded, who are like that women are gravitating towards, either they're grounded or they have a guitar or both, but they're like, they're gravitating towards these men who are like, I actually don't want that person because she's not in integrity.
That's right.
Like they're in this place of such rootedness and purpose that it's attractive. And I know when I started to follow what I really wanted to do, which came through my pain, through the confession.
Yeah.
Like I don't love what I do. I love relationships and, like I want to understand them. When I finally did what you're saying and was starting to stand in my voice and my truth, nothing would have pulled me away from that mission, and nothing would pull me away from it now. And that it just became more attractive, and so I love everything you're saying because it's putting into words what I've experienced and really feel, and what I value. And I think one way, and I'm sure you say this, I'm sure, but one thing that I see your book really serving is instead of it, because often you were saying we wait for destruction or we wait for the rock bottom to get the call. And I think often relationships can be the call.
Yeah.
But the book can be the call.
Yeah.
Right? It's like we might just have a sense of there's something more. My partner said she needs more from me. And I'm like, what the fuck does more mean?
Yeah, what does that even mean?
Right. And I think your book can really serve that. And so thank you for writing it, and thanks for the work that you do. And
Thanks, man.
I'm sure there's people watching this or listening to this are like, I have so many more questions for Connor. The book answers the questions.
I mean, I don't know how to answer all the questions, but I hope it does. And the more that I've done this work, the more that I have found that a man who is connected to his own sense of presence is such a gift to our world.
Yeah.
Whether that's to his children, whether that's to the person that he's dating, his family, his friends. Like, your gift as a man is presence, and then from that presence can emerge what you want to give to the world, and when you couple that with your gifts, there's a deep sense of purpose. But if we are, our modern culture is very medicated and very distracted. And so it's very challenging for us. And I think a lot of us, like myself, and I've talked about this in my journey already on this podcast, but like, I was very avoidant of my own stuff. And it required me to get present to those things that were existing inside of me and in my life that were hard and painful. And when I learned to get present to those things, I not only built up tolerance towards them, but I learned how to carry them more effectively, and that in itself is a kind of growth or expansion, however you want to call that, that has radically changed my life. And, I think the people that are sometimes drawn to my work, it's like, it's just the presence. There's something there that, like a friend of mine, Dewey Freeman, who's now a mentor, he's like 72, this wonderful guy.
He's a ninja.
He's a cowboy. He's like a real life cowboy. He talks about, a really good practitioner, facilitator, healer. What they're doing is extending their nervous system.
Yeah.
And allowing other people to feel the safety that resides within that sort of cocoon. But that requires presence, right? We can't be distracted by task lists and to-do lists and, the shame that we're carrying around from whatever it is, the infidelity or the indiscretion of DMing some, thirst trap on Instagram or whatever it is. Like that, all that's distraction, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to start to return to this seat of presence that lives within us. And that's a little bit more esoteric and energetic, and maybe that's not,
It's also based on somatics and
Sure.
nervous system. There is that which cannot be named, but is felt in co-regulation and groundedness. We were going to talk about pornography.
It's kind of ironic that we're finishing on porn, like there's some
The
terrible
joke of
joke
finishing?
in there. Yeah, finishing on porn.
Yeah. Well, once you start looking for sexual puns, you can find them everywhere.
That's true.
When I worked as a pharmaceutical rep, the people who sold things like Viagra and Cialis, there's just so many jokes.
Totally.
It's endless. Anyway, so pornography.
Yeah, there's definitely a bunch of different ways that we could get into this. I think, I generally talk about it as I'm not interested in having the debate about whether porn is good or bad, because people get lost in that debate all the time.
And it exists. So.
And it just doesn't necessarily do anything. I think one of the big things, not that debate isn't necessary or helpful in some areas, but for the purpose of what I talked about in the book is a lot of writing about, like, what does porn actually do to your brain? Like, what's your brain and your body like on porn? And
what does it do to your brain?
Well, so porn, for the most part, it's entertainment, right? I think I've interviewed people that have been in the porn industry, and that's what they talk about. It's an entertainment, and it's treated as entertainment. But porn is, from a neurological perspective, it's what's called a supranormal experience. And so what that means is, like, for example, over the holidays, over Christmas, over Thanksgiving, you generally eat more than you normally would, right? So you consume a whole bunch. And that's a supernormal experience, right? Where your body actually consumes more or takes in more than it normally would, whether that's food or information or stimulation, right? So that's a supernormal experience. Porn does the same thing, where you are over consuming from a sensory aspect, right? Because you can acquire whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want. Right? Whatever type of porn you want to watch, whatever your mind goes to, you can have it in that moment, which is not necessarily how the majority of people's sex lives go.
Right.
Right? You're not getting what you want, when you want, however you want, all the time, constantly. And pornography offers that up. And so the way that our bodies work, and I'll break this down in a few different ways, but the way that our bodies work is like, if you have a supernormal experience where you have a massive turkey dinner, your body can digest that fairly easily, and it can return to homeostasis or return to baseline, right? Not really a big deal. Not really a lot of consequences. It's not going to mess up your hormones. It's not going to mess up the neurochemicals being released in your brain. You can return. If you were to eat that massive meal every single dinner, that's going to have some adverse consequences over time. So what porn does is when you're watching porn, you have essentially a very similar experience to what you would have during sex. Like your brain can't really tell the difference between the screen and a sexual encounter, right? So it kind of thinks that it's a part of it. So what happens over time is as you watch more and more porn, or as you watch more porn in one sitting, your brain needs to consume more and more content, and it needs to consume more and more volatile or fringe content in order to get the same amount of arousal, right? The same amount of satiation. So this is where you see people that have like 100 tabs open with, different photos and videos and all going at the same time. Or you have, people that watch for extended amounts of time, right? So I talk about my relationship to porn. I talk about how it's clearly biased because I struggled with porn for a long time. And it was something that was always in the background of my life and my relationships. And I watched it a lot. I watched it most days. I watched it sometimes for hours. And for some people, the effects that it'll have on them is that they no longer get the same type of arousal from a real sexual encounter. So some men will, over time, experience not being able to get aroused with their partner.
I can't get an erection.
Can't get an erection.
Makes sense.
They'll want more and more sort of fringe-oriented experiences in order to feel satiated or satisfied. But I think one of the biggest things that I talk about is that porn for a lot of men has become a tool to regulate their nervous system. It's become a tool for us to feel good really quick. So if you come home after a long day and you're stressed out and the kids are yelling and you don't have any tools or practices to calm yourself down and ground before you go to bed and you have trouble sleeping, porn's a really quick way for you to get off, feel better, and get a big dopamine hit, right? Because after you watch porn and after you ejaculate as a man, dopamine is released, oxytocin is released, which is the bonding chemical, and then something called prolactin. And prolactin is the chemical, in women it does something different, but in men it's the thing that allows our body to sort of just completely relax. So that sensation after you orgasm where you're like, you're like, time for a cigarette, that's prolactin. And so for a lot of guys, it becomes the tool where if you're stressed, you watch porn, you feel better, right? You feel a little bit less stressed out. If you're anxious, you watch porn, you jerk off, you feel better. You're angry, you're disconnected, you're lonely, you're whatever it is. Whatever it is that you don't want to feel or experience, porn has become a lot of men's tool or resource to circumvent that feeling very quickly. But the problem is that for a lot of guys who have trauma or, don't have other tools or resources to help them regulate, it becomes the primary tool for them to just reach a baseline, for them to feel a normal sense of no anxiety, no stress, no loneliness, no whatever. That's the challenge. And then a lot of the studies have shown, and I include a bunch of the research in the book, a lot of studies have shown that after you climax as a man, you have a lot of dopamine that gets released. Some people call it a dopamine dump. It's not actually a dopamine dump. It's just that there's an increase of dopamine in your system. But then afterwards, there's a recession of it. So you actually go into a dopamine deficit afterwards. So for a lot of guys that watch porn sort of chronically, whether that's, 2 to 3 times a week, that's considered chronic, what you'll actually find is that these recessions of dopamine get more and more and more and more. And so for you to get the same type of ecstatic feeling and that sort of rush after watching porn and getting off, you need more of it and you need to consume more sort of fringe stuff in order to get that same level of excitement. Most guys don't actually know how an erection works. And I feel like there's merit in talking about that, if that's okay.
Sure, I love a good boner. Let's get into it. Let's get into the physiology.
So 2 parts to your autonomic nervous system, right? You've got the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic's the gas pedal, parasympathetic is the brake pedal. So the sympathetic is like fight, flight, or freeze. It's the go. It's what allows you to get shit done, right? Parasympathetic is the rest and digest. That's the part of your nervous system that is responsible for you feeling calm and grounded and just when you chill out, right? When you're just relaxed. So what most men think when they're like, oh, well, for my erection to work, it's just blood flowing into my penis, right? Well, yeah, that's part of it. But the really important part is actually your nervous system, your autonomic nervous system needs to be in a parasympathetic dominant state. So your body actually needs to be in a rest and digest state. It needs to be relaxed in order for you to get really aroused. So a lot of men that are struggling with non-medical premature ejaculation, or a lot of men that are struggling with non-medical erectile dysfunction, what's actually happening is that their body is in a predominantly sympathetic response, a predominantly stressed response, and that's not conducive for getting aroused. And so they're losing their erection, they are orgasming too quickly, and that's happening because they're stressed. So when you think about something like performance anxiety, what's happening within a man is that he's self-referencing, right? Am I going to come too quickly? Am I going to stay hard long enough? Is she going to enjoy this? Am I going to perform well? And all of that self-referencing causes a man's internal stress to go up. And generally speaking, what happens is that your respiratory rate will start to go up. So that means that you'll start to take more breaths per minute. That'll start to go up. Your heart rate will start to go up. And then your body will actually start to put out more stress hormones. So adrenaline and norepinephrine and some of those other stress hormones and chemicals. So what happens is, in order for you to be aroused in a man and get a hard-on, your body needs to be in this relaxed state, and it allows blood to flow properly, because when you're relaxed, your veins are actually more open, blood flows more easily, and the more stressed you are, the more constriction there is around veins. So the more that your body actually pulls blood into your core. So if you're somebody who has high stress in his life, or high anxiety, or is constantly angry, your system, your nervous system is naturally going to be in that more stressed orientation, meaning that you're going to have a harder time relaxing into the sexual encounter, relaxing into the sexual experience. And the way that a man's arousal actually works, the arc of it, is that you are in this parasympathetic nervous system dominant state where you're more rested, you're more relaxed. And the closer you come to climax and orgasming, the more that your system shifts into that sympathetic response in the nervous system. And when you climax, you actually move into a heavy sympathetic nervous system response for a brief moment, right? For 5 to 15 seconds. You climax, and then you go all the way back into that rest and digest, all the way back into that parasympathetic nervous system response, dominant response. So where porn fits into this is that it's very easy for a man to use that as a tool to regulate his nervous system to feel more grounded and more calm, because there's no risk, right? He doesn't have to take the risk.
Intimacy.
Well, you don't have to risk rejection. You don't have to risk getting turned down. You don't have to risk approaching your partner and saying like, hey, I'd like to have sex tonight, or I'm really turned on by you, and having them say like, no, I'm not interested, or not tonight, or I'm tired, or whatever it is. So there's less risk. There's you're not going to face rejection. And so it's just a little bit of an easier tool for a lot of men, but it doesn't mean that it's the right tool.
I have a question. So the way that pornography obviously feeds, as you said, we can't tell the difference between porn and the real experience. And I think VR porn, which I've never used because I know I don't stand a chance against it.
I haven't either.
Right. But I've seen that it exists, and I'm like, that's not good. Because it would be totally immersive outside of, and I'm sure they'll have devices that make it feel like you're actually going through that thing.
Yeah.
Which part of me is like, that's pretty cool, and I want to try that. And the other part of me being like, don't, because that's the same reason you didn't try cocaine.
Right.
Right.
Dude,
because I'd still be doing it.
Yeah, that's right.
Same. I'm very prone, I like over-consuming everything, as you know. What's the cost to our relationships? Because I think a lot of men are probably doing this sort of secretly, or
totally,
or if they're feeling rejected in their relationship, porn might be the way that they resolve or soothe that rejection. And how do we begin to decouple nervous system regulation through pornography and then learning self-regulation?
So the cost of the relationship, I think each man needs to discern that for himself. I really think that each man who has porn be an active part of his life needs to be really honest with himself about what price he maybe is paying or his relationship is paying for him having porn be a part of it. For me, I'll speak from personal experience and some of the experience of what I've seen with men, because like I said, I've been working with men for a decade, and I've worked with tens of thousands of guys, and a lot of them struggled to let go of porn, struggled to stop watching it. For me, porn was part of the barrier for me to bring the full sexual expression of myself into my relationship. So rather than me saying, here's the fantasies I want to explore, here's the type of sexual interaction I want to have, here's the type of power dynamic or role play that I want to experience or explore, I would just go watch that in porn. Or I would go get it from an external relationship. So I would have my primary relationship with somebody that I loved, and then I would go and find women to enact these sort of other sexual experiences with that I wanted to have in my primary relationship, but would largely only bring to the women that I was having affairs with, that I was cheating on with. And so I think for a lot of guys, they end up splitting their sexual personality. They end up having the kind of nice relationship, decent, maybe nice sex with their partner, and then sort of longing for this experience of bringing out the fullness of their sexual expression. And maybe that gets expressed through porn or cams or OnlyFans. That's my experience. The price that I was paying, the impact that it had on my relationship, is that my core relationships with the women that I really loved and wanted to be with never got the fullness of my sexual expression. And I deeply desired that. I really wanted to be able to bring all of who I was sexually into a relationship rather than having this divide. And I think a lot of men feel that if they're really honest, or they've just never even had the space to explore the depths of their sexual expression in a relationship. And they long for that. The answer to the second question about regulating our nervous system and sort of decoupling that part, there's some great work. I'm blanking on the woman's name right now. I had this woman on my podcast from Harvard who did work on testosterone. I had another woman from Stanford who did, she's like one of the leading researchers on addiction. And one of the most effective tools is to go on a dopamine detox. So when you see things like No Nut November or No FAP,
What's No FAP?
No FAP is no masturbation.
Oh.
So if you see these things are usually around November.
What's with November?
Right? It's my birthday. My birthday's in November.
Me too.
I'm all about it. It's that Scorpio life, right? It's
you should be jerking off a lot.
The powerhouse of sexual expression.
So wait, so November, because that's Movember.
That's right.
So you grow a mustache and you don't jerk off.
You don't jerk off and you don't orgasm.
Even though if you have a mustache, it looks like you probably jerk off a lot. That's the irony.
I mean, when I have a mustache, I'll only definitely.
Dude, my mustache
I look like
is
straight
so
perv,
bad.
straight
I've got
perv.
a good sweeper. Nothing else is really. I got a good neck beard, which that's not anything to brag about. I have a thick neck, thick stash. It's bad.
That's good.
It's bad.
Where were we going with
decoupling.
that? Yeah, the decoupling. Yeah.
So you could take these sort of like dopamine fasts.
Yeah, you can do a dopamine
where you're
fast.
artificially creating dopamine.
Yeah, and you what I normally recommend to guys, and part of what I put in the book was every man has a porn ritual. Every man that I've ever worked with has a porn ritual. He watches it at a certain time, on a certain device, in a certain place. And some men have a lot, like they've ritualized their porn watching, where some guys will light candles and other guys,
I never got that romantic about my pornography.
Yeah, maybe not that romantic, but you probably watched it,
similar
times, similar places, under similar
circumstances.
Probably,
I never scored it, but for sure, feeling bored, feeling whatever it is,
Yeah, so
you're like, or you come across a titty, and all of a sudden you're like, I could jerk off right now.
Right, yeah.
Like and now, I mean, social
Instagram.
media, as much as I put not interested, they come back up.
They just put it back up.
It's like, stop it.
Yeah.
They're just like, you don't like it served that way.
Right.
Don't worry, we have one playing tennis.
Yeah, you don't like the full-on ass What about the side from the left?
Right.
What if we just give you the left cheek?
How about someone rock climbing? Then it's just an ass against a rock.
Fucking rock climbing.
I'm like, I like
Just sneak it
mountains,
in
and
there.
they sneak it in there.
Right. Here's a booty on
How
a
about
rock
beach
mountain.
volleyball?
Man.
We know why people watch that. Okay, it's a great sport. But
So-
I get that desire to deplete.
Yeah.
But also, what do you do with how do you self-soothe?
So part of it is like get clear on what your ritual is. Go on a dedicated dopamine fast or detox, and know that it might take a few tries. Like it took me a couple of years to like really let go of porn.
Yeah.
It didn't happen the first time that I tried it, but I think most guys don't have the same type of usage that I had. That's part of it. The next part is understand what you're feeling before you want to watch porn.
Yeah, the triggering
The
emotion.
initial trigger, right? So like, are you feeling anxious and you just want to feel more calm? Are you feeling angry at your partner and disconnected and lonely? Like, what are you actually feeling? Because that's what you need to address. That's what you need to be with and sit with. And then next, pick up some regulation practices, pick up breath work, pick up like breath work. The breath is the conduit between, your autonomic nervous system is like a seesaw, right? Between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. But the breath is actually the tool that allows you to move from one side of the seesaw to the other. So if you want to, just naturally taking more breaths per minute is naturally going to, and breathing through your mouth is naturally going to tip your autonomic nervous system into that more stressed orientation. Slowing the breath down and taking less breaths per minute and relaxing into that breath is naturally going to move it towards that more parasympathetic, calm orientation. So for men, a big part of it, what I say is pick up some form of breath work practice or energy practice, right? Whether it's Tai Chi or going to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or some form of martial art, some form of yoga or
Going
like
for a
Qigong.
walk.
All of those things,
Qigong.
rock climbing,
Speaking
of rock climbing, yeah, although, based on what we were just talking
maybe
about.
a little pair of Nike Pros and just send them to your friends.
I wear the tightest of shorts to rock climbing.
I mean, it's a great sport.
Yeah.
To be immersed in nature. And then, I know in the conversation about nervous system regulation is about riding the wave.
That's right.
Like moving through the feeling that comes up.
Yeah.
And letting it will go.
It will go.
But we're so used to trying to treat it or negate it or dismiss it or dopamine it.
We usually I found that men usually respond from two ways, right? We react to it and become it, or we try and shut it down entirely.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I don't want to feel this way. I'm going to try and stuff that shit down. Or we just give over to it and we become it, right? And we just allow it to run rampant. And then we want to get away from it.
Do you speak about all these solutions in your book?
Yeah, I have in the section around porn, I actually have a methodology mapped out because the book is designed to be a guide that there's questions in every single chapter for men to self-reflect. And then there's exercises for men to integrate the principles. So there's actual practices that men can do as they go through the book, whether it's, about the section with women or their fathers or pornography or leaving a legacy in the world. I've designed it so that you got to do some work along the way. It's called men's work. You got to do some work along the way.
The beautiful work of getting to know yourself and heal yourself. Well, thank you, sir, for coming.
Yes, sir.
And where can people find your book? Where can you have a podcast? So just tell them all the places to find more of Connor Beaton.
Yeah, probably the easiest way is ManTalks.com. The book is at ManTalks.com/book. You can also just search for men's work on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. It's at all the major bookstores. And
Perfect.
then you can find the podcast and whatnot on there, but also at ManTalks on Instagram if you want to follow along.
Perfect. We'll make sure we put all those links in the show notes.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate you, brother.
Love you, buddy.
Love you too.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. If this episode resonated with you, one of the best ways to support the show is to go subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any more. Leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it, or share the episode with your community on Instagram or whatever social place you like to hang out. This helps get it into more people's ears, and I'm so grateful for your support, always. Thanks again for tuning in. Much love.